Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, where we communicate concepts, tools and techniques to you that you will want to understand before taking the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and as you may have guessed from this opening, this lesson here is the overview of project communications management. We look at the processes, the knowledge area, talk about the basic communications model, and discuss communication styles and more. And next to the topics that I have just mentioned, we'll also look at the communications channels, describe that communications model. We define what noise means in communication. You will understand context in terms of language, and you will know when and why we use written communication and verbal communication. But let's begin with our usual overview of the knowledge area, followed by the processes. There are a lot of elements involved in project communications management. Here's the definition. Project communications management includes the processes that are required to ensure timely and appropriate planning, collection, creation, distribution, storage, retrieval, management, control, monitoring, and the ultimate disposition of project information. Why do I say ultimately? Well, disposition signifies that the communication cycle has been completed. You have delivered the information, and disposition is the final step. And to help us with this, the Project Communications Management knowledge area has three processes. Plan Communications Management, which is in the Planning Process Group. Manage Communications, which is in the Executing Process Group. And Control Communications, which by its sheer name you can tell is in the Monitoring and Controlling Process Group. These processes are independent of each other, used to continually determine whether or not the stakeholder project needs are current, accurate, and followed. Let's look at the definition of these three processes, beginning with Plan Communications Management, which is the process of developing an appropriate approach and plan for project communications based on stakeholder information needs and requirements and available organizational assets. Manage Communications is the process of creating, collecting, distributing, storing, retrieving, and the ultimate disposition of project information in accordance with the communications management plan. And finally, Control Communications, that is the process of monitoring and controlling communications throughout the entire project lifecycle to ensure the information needs of the project stakeholders are met. It is very likely that you will spend the least amount of your study time on project communications management. Most of what you need to know comes straight from the PMBOK guide. There are some key concepts that you need to understand. There is one formula to remember, but as they say, if you know that when the phone rings, which end of the phone to put to your ear and which one to speak into, well, you have pretty much mastered communications management for the PMP exam. But don't underestimate the importance of good communications, both on a project and for the PMP exam. Communications is one of the biggest critical success factors on a project. If you mess up your communications, you will mess up your project. Let's begin with the only formula that you will need to remember in project communications management, and that is the communications channels formula. The formula answers the following question here. If you have 20 stakeholders on a project, how many possible communication channels are there among them? So let's take a look at that. Let's assume that you and I are on this project together. So I will have 19 communications channels on this project because I have to speak to you and 18 other team members here in this team of 20, okay? You and I, we have already spoken because you and I are part of those 19 that you see. So that means you are going to have to speak to 18 other people in the team. And then the next person on the team will have 17 other people that they speak to because they've already spoken to you and I. And of course, then the next person after that will have 16, 15, 14, 13, etc. And if we turn all of that into a formula, then the formula reads n times n minus 1 divided by 2. And in this formula, n stands for the number of people on the team. So in our example, that would be 20. Here is what this would look like. So we have 20 times 20 minus 1 divided by 2, which turns out that on a team of 20 people, you have 190 possible communications channels. We will get back to this formula when we plan communications in the next lesson. And to each of these 190 possible communications channels, possible conversations, the basic communications model applies. Let's take a look at that. So we have two people here communicating. On the left side, we have the sender, and on the right side, we have the receiver. Of course, left side, the sender sends a message, and on the right side, the receiver will send a response back. So let's begin on the left-hand side and see what happens on the sender side. Here, the sender forms the message that he or she wishes to send and also chooses a medium through which the message is going to be communicated over, and also chooses the symbols, the words, the content that has to be created with symbols. And in most cases, these symbols are the language that we use, of course. The receiver then, once he receives the message, will convert the symbols and try to understand what these symbols mean, and then also goes ahead and formats a response back to the sender. And of course, in both cases, you've probably already noticed this, there is a translation happening. On the sender's side, the idea that forms in the sender's head has to be translated into a communicable format. And on the receiver side, the response has to be communicated from the idea that the receiver has in his mind into a message that can be sent back as a response to the original sender. In this model, the sender of a message is responsible for confirming with the receiver that the message was understood properly, and the receiver is responsible for acknowledging that he or she has indeed received the message. This acknowledgement or receipt is an important part of this basic communications model. It means that the receiver indicates, yes, I have received your message. Whether or not the message has really been understood, that is totally completely different subject here. And there are many reasons why a receiver may not be able to understand the message. And this is where the last items comes into play here, and that is noise. On this communications channel, there may be some form of a noise that interferes with the message that is being sent back and forth. Let's look more closely at what causes this noise. And by noise, yes, we do mean actual noise, like construction going on outside your office and you can't hear the person speaking. But we also mean all form of interference with the communication, beginning with distance, because it's easier to talk to someone in the same room than it is to talk to them on the phone or via a video conference. And then there are language barriers. Even though I speak English, some of you probably think that I have a funny accent. The same could happen on your project. Well, I don't actually mean that I'll be working on your project, but there could be somebody on your project who has a very thick accent and is difficult to understand. Then we have culture. We all have different approaches to eye contact and body language. What may be acceptable as a hand gesture for me may look extremely rude to you. Then we have misinterpretation. Here, this is really a breakdown of the encoding and decoding on our communications model. And then, of course, we also have interpersonal problems. If you don't like the speaker, you will very likely have problems listening to what they really are saying. One more note about languages. There is a big difference in how you frame a request, a question, or a statement from one language to the next. This is known as context. Some languages have a very low context and others have a very high context. And here are 3 examples for you, beginning with my mother tongue, which is Swiss German. We have a very low context. We are extremely direct. If I want you to do something in Swiss German, I say, do this. And it's not meant as being rude, that's just the way we talk. English falls somewhere in between here, and it means that if I want you to do something in English, I would begin most likely by saying something along the lines of, would you please do this? Would you please be kind enough and do this? The effect is the same in Swiss German and in English. I hopefully get you to do this, but Swiss German just has a much lower context. We're much more straightforward and to the point without us feeling that the speaker is actually being rude. And then at the very far right, very high context, we always use Japanese as an example here. Japanese has a very high context. We talk in a more roundabout way here. An implicit understanding of the situation and what is meant has to be understood by the speaker, by the sender, and by the receiver of the message, so that the intent of the message gets across. So there you go. Swiss German, very low context. English, sort of somewhere in the middle. And then Japanese, a very high context when it comes to language. Okay, but why would we need to know and understand all these various components of the basic communications model? Well, the answer is that in order to effectively communicate with the members of your project, you must first understand the message and transmission between 2 people. That will increase empathy for the recipient of a message that you are sending, if you know how they will receive and translate your message. And that again will result in better message formulation by you. For instance, you get insight into their point of view, whether they prefer a bullet list or graphics, and what style of language they prefer. So in other words, you know the receiver, you adjust the way you send, develop, create, encode the message so that you can make sure that the receiver will get the message and be able to decode the message and understand the message properly. And that brings us to the method of communication. In the basic model that we looked at a couple of slides back, this is the medium through which you transmit the message. Here it is important for you to understand when to use what. For instance, when should you use an email? When should you send a report? When should you pick up the phone? And when is a face-to-face meeting appropriate or even necessary? Well, it depends. It depends on the communication needs of your stakeholders. So know the pluses and minuses for each of those. For example, a report is formal and you can refer back to it later. However, during a personal conversation, it is much easier to ensure that the receiver has indeed understood your message, but of course the conversation is not normally documented. And here is an important sentence for you to remember. According to Harold Kersner, a project manager spends a whopping 90% of his or her time on communications. In other words, communicating is pretty much what we do as project managers all day long. This fact is often used in sample questions, and you must remember it for the exam. Of course, this is not necessarily a hard number, 90%, somewhere 75 to 85%, 80 to 95%. Those are also acceptable numbers. But according to Kersner, 90% is the number. It's also a reminder to show how important communication is as a project success criteria. So if we are communicating 90% of the time, we want to make sure that we communicate with the right people and don't forget anyone, and that's what we have the communications management plan for, to determine what needs to be communicated to whom and when. Management and customers and other concerned stakeholders, they will most likely be interested in the performance of the project. And as the project manager, you will need to meet their expectations on an established schedule based on conditions within the project when it comes to reporting this information to them. You probably heard me say this before. So what is the absolute bestest, super bestest, and most wonderfulest tool that we have at our disposal to report performance on our project? You guessed it. It's once again earned value. Okay, so let's go back to the plan. Let's take a look inside, very high level here. What do we find in the communications management plan? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We find the what, the why, the how often, and when. What do we have to communicate? Why do we communicate it? Usually because the stakeholder asked for it. How do we communicate it? For example, we send an email. How often do we do that? Well, we send it every Friday, and on a weekly basis. Every Friday is the how often and when. Yes, and all of that gets defined in the communications management plan. And like every other management plan, the communications management plan is a subsidiary plan of the overall project management plan. This can be formal or informal. It's highly detailed. It could be broadly framed. That means a statement, like we've just heard it on the previous slide, saying that I'll be sending a written project status report to you every other Friday. That could be your communications management plan on a very small project. However, on most larger projects, you're going to want to have something written and formal. You also have to understand that you cannot completely control communications on your project. Even though we go through all of this planning, there is simply no absolute control. There are always informal communication channels, and stakeholder needs will change. Planning, however, will help us to guide project communications into the proper predefined channels, methods, and technologies. We mention this a lot, but especially in project communications management, it's important to remember to be proactive in your communication. So don't wait to communicate bad news. One of the worst things you can do is to surprise your management or your customers during an important meeting and telling them that you are 2 months behind schedule. You should have communicated this fact months ago when it became first apparent that there will be delays. Similarly, don't wait to communicate good news either. If you can be done with your project 2 months earlier or at 15% less cost, then you want people to know this early as well. They may have to adjust their own planning based on your good news. And lastly, you want to proactively manage the news that you provide to your stakeholders. It is your responsibility to get in touch with them proactively and find out their concerns. Give them a phone call, allowing them the opportunity to talk to you. As far as the PMP exam goes, you should know and understand the following 5 communication types, beginning with the non-verbal communication type. Here we were thinking about eye contact, we think about body language. Then there is paralingual. This is something that you hear me do all the time because you don't see me, so I have to use the inflection of my voice to get things across to you. Then active listening is next. Here you have to do things like nodding. You go as the person is speaking. You lean forward. You face the speaker. Effective listening involves things like asking questions, paraphrasing the information, holding up a mirror, sort of saying, did I understand you correctly? I think you said X. Is that right? And of course, lastly, there's also feedback. You give feedback to the speaker about what has been said. But feedback, grain of salt here, should only be given when you're asked to give feedback, when you know that the feedback will be welcome on the other side. We have already touched upon this slightly, but when would you, for instance, prefer to communicate in writing versus verbally? Well, in writing, when you have a lot of complex information that needs to be communicated to a group of stakeholders and you want to keep a record verbally or orally, if you prefer, when you are looking for the personal touch and not only want to communicate information, but you also want to allow and give opportunity for questions and some relationship building. So it is very important to consider the combined choice of media and method as an approach with which you transmit your messages. And while we're talking about written versus verbal, there's also the question of, well, what is formal and what is informal? It's quite easy, really. Formal written, here we're talking about status reports, project charters, or a management plan. Informal written are emails, memos, online chats, forums, discussions. Formal verbal, those would be presentations, speeches, press conferences, or hearings. And of course, informal verbal communication is all conversations, phone calls, or hallway meetings. And when it comes to questions about these, what we have seen in the commercially available simulators and books are questions like, a status report is an example of A, B, C, and D. And then, of course, the correct answer would be that it is a formal written form of communication. And which of these 4 methods here would you say is generally accepted as the best communications method, especially when we're talking about the PMP exam? Take a look. Well, face-to-face, the last one here in the list, is of course, for the PMP exam especially, the best one to choose because it offers a direct link to the person whom you are communicating with. You build a relationship. You can pick up on subtle communication clues like the tone of voice or the body language, and it is much easier to ensure clarity of the communication in a face-to-face meeting. Remember, communications management is a continuing process that changes throughout the project. I want you to know and understand each of the elements that you saw appear here on the outside of this circle here. Starting at the top there at 12 o'clock, the channels know how to calculate the communication channels with the formula. And again, we'll look at that in an upcoming lesson again in more detail. Understand the different communication models and how to use them. Know the definition of noise there. Context. Understand that context is something that has to do with language and that we have languages with low and high context, and of course know when to use which technology or when to use written or verbal communication. And now let's continue by looking at a few more sample questions. In regards to project communications management and sample questions available in books and online simulators, there's one little factoid that comes up again and again. Since there is only one formula in project communications management, you have to know and be able to apply the communications channels formula. One question that I remember in particular was this one here. How many more communication channels do you have if you add one more resource to a 10-person team? Well, in order to answer this, you first have to calculate the communication channels for a 10-people team, then for an 11-people team, and subtract the two numbers. And by the way, the answer here is 10. And another little, or shall we say big fact that the exam will inevitably talk about is the time a project manager communicates. Do you remember what percentage of a project manager's time is spent in communicating? Yes, it is 90%. But as I said, if they give you a range of, say, 75 to 90 or 85 to 95%, that would, of course, also be correct. Or what is an example of a formal written piece of communication on your project? Here, a status report would be a good answer. And please do not forget that according to PMI and for the PMP exam, an email is considered to be an informal type of written communication. And with that, we have come to the end of our overview of project communications management. So it's time for Justine to say,
So long, farewell. Auf Wiedersehen, good night.
And of course I say, until next time.